why can't Cliffe Knechtle answer Alex O'Connor on biblical genocide? Alex O'Connor recently met with Cliffe and Stuart Knechtle to discuss a range of topics and again raised the objection of the genocide of the Canaanites, saying,
Do you think that this grace, this omnipotence, this love and charity of the Old Testament God is expressed in the instances where he commands the complete obliteration of entire nations of people, including the women and the children, and even the animals, at multiple points throughout the history of the Israelites trying to conquer their holy land, which is promised to them by God, such that if anybody is already living there, they're driven out, and if they refuse to leave, they're chased out and they're killed, and then they come back and they kill the women and the children. Do you think that this is the same graceful, loving God that's issuing these commands?
Cliffe's response was certainly better than the one he received from Dinesh D'Souza. It was clear and thoughtful, and he did make some good points. Here is his response.
No. Instead, I think we've got to read very carefully. First point, do I allow God to judge? In my culture, that's unacceptable. And yet the Bible insists God does have the right to judge. Second point, is exaggeration being used? Is hyperbole being used in a lot of those passages? Yes, it is. Because clearly, obviously, many of those people who were supposedly all wiped out appear in the next book. So you know that they weren't all wiped out. Mm-hmm. Thirdly, you look at the archaeological evidence for Jericho and Ai, and you begin to realize those were probably smaller fortresses. Yes, Rahab was in there as a prostitute, but those were not just families and women and children. Those were fortresses that were protecting the families that lived out in the countryside around them. Next point is, I think that there is not the emphasis on individualism in the Old Testament that we have in our culture.
Yep.
And yet, the more we struggle through children of alcoholics and realize that there are real consequences that stretch down through the generations. And I think the Old Testament does present a picture that we are more interconnected than we as American individualists would like to admit. And when God judges a people group, yes, some innocent people are swept along in the judgment. And that bugs me. I don't like that. And yet, that is part of, I think, what the Bible is talking about when it says we're created in the image of God, meaning that we do have free will, which means there are consequences to my decisions that affect my children, that affect my grandchildren. We're more interconnected than we would like to admit. So no, those children are not being punished for anything they did wrong, but yes, they're born into a cursed, messed up world, and there are consequences to that. I mean, I benefited from going to Davidson College, and a lot of people sacrificed to put Davidson together. You benefited from going to Oxford University, and there are a lot of people who have, over many years, given sacrificially to build that. So there are real consequences that stretch down through the generations of our decisions. And also, the Bible never says that those children and all those people go to eternity separate from God. I'm convinced that we will see those children in heaven if they were killed before an age of accountability. So the justice of God will ultimately triumph.
Yeah.
But do I have problems with the text? Yes, of course I have problems with the text. I don't understand it exactly. I don't understand what God is doing exactly there, why he says that kind of thing. But I'm also convinced that hyperbole is being used. And I think that's a very important thing. For instance, when I was in high school, we used to say, we're going to kill the opposing team that we're going to play that weekend. Not meaning we're literally going to kill them. And the whole idea of, in the Hebrew herem, H-E-R-E-M, of clearing out these people from the promised land. The whole idea that God had given them over 400 years to repent, and they had chosen not to, and now God clears them out.
Cliffe's observations about generational sin may well have some merit, and his use of William Lane Craig's argument that the Canaanite children went to heaven may be persuasive to some, but Alex is extremely unlikely to be satisfied with this answer, and neither are most unbelieving viewers. Furthermore, the suggestion that God's command to utterly annihilate the tribes living in the Promised Land is hyperbole creates far more problems than it solves. The command, which is found in Deuteronomy 20, says, "In the cities of the nations that the Lord your God is giving to you as an inheritance, do not leave anything alive that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you." Cliffe's claim that the presence of survivors in later chapters shows that this command was hyperbole is completely false. All it really shows is that the Israelites were not completely successful in carrying out the command. In fact, when King Saul later spares just one of the survivors of these wars of annihilation, he is judged and condemned by God, which proves that God really did mean it when he said, "Do not leave anything alive that breathes." Furthermore, the idea that God's command was really a command to go to war with competence only, and that phrases such as "do not leave anything alive that breathes" were hyperbole, make God both imprecise and reckless with his words. If Benjamin Netanyahu gave the instruction, "Do not leave anything alive that breathes," to the IDF when they went to war in Gaza, nobody would believe that he really meant that they should restrict themselves to military targets. And if that is what he really meant, he would be condemned for reckless use of language and rightly held responsible for the civilian deaths that followed the command. There is no getting around the fact that the conquest of Canaan was a genocide. Indeed, the command to annihilate all living things in the land, known as the harem, is contrasted in the text with the command for war with other nations, in which women and children are spared. The answer is not to minimize the genocide, but to justify it by identifying God's reasons for wanting to destroy an entire people group. Many would object to this on the grounds that any justification for genocide is necessarily immoral and could be used to justify future genocides. However, justifying God's command to carry out a genocide does not mean that any human leader can be justified in doing so. Humans do not have the right to take the lives of other humans unless they are executing murderers or defending their homelands. However, God gave life, and therefore he has the right to take it away. If he judges a people group to be so corrupt that they no longer have a place in his creation, then he is fully justified in annihilating them, just as he did in the Great Flood, when all who had the breath of life were killed except Noah and his family. So what could justify the genocide of the pre-flood humans and the inhabitants of Canaan? Clearly, they were idolatrous. Archaeological evidence shows that the Canaanites practiced child sacrifice, but even this is not enough. The Bible records that both groups were guilty of an even worse offense, interbreeding with fallen angels, and that whole clans were in fact hybrid beings called the Nephilim, the offspring of an unholy union between fallen angels and human women who were of gigantic size. Ancient giants who were worshipped as gods and sought to corrupt all of humanity. Just before the account of the flood, the book of Genesis says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created." The line "and also afterwards" suggests that this interbreeding between humans and angels occurred again long after the Great Flood, and the book of Numbers reveals that before the conquest of Canaan, spies were sent into Israel and asked to report back on what they had seen there. They said, "We went into the land which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the descendants who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Clearly then, many of the inhabitants of Canaan were Nephilim, specifically the descendants of the giant Anak, called the Anakites, and this included the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, and the Canaanites, who God specifically commanded Israel to annihilate. Joshua's speech in Deuteronomy, which sets the scene for the conquest of Canaan, also refers to their great height and strength. Hear, O Israel, you are now about to cross the Jordan to go in and dispossess nations greater and stronger than you, with large cities that have walls up to the sky. The people are strong and tall, Anakites. You know about them and have heard it said, who can stand up against the Anakites? But be assured today that the Lord your God is the one who goes across ahead of you like a devouring fire. He will destroy them. He will subdue them before you, and you will drive them out and annihilate them. This command to completely annihilate the harem was therefore not primarily directed at sinful humans who were living in the land, but towards the Nephilim, human angelic hybrids. According to biblical scholar Michael Heiser, its meaning is not that all the inhabitants of the land are to be put under harem because everyone is a giant. Its meaning is that wherever they are found, the bloodlines of the giant clans, the descendants of the Nephilim, are to be eradicated. The whole conquest, which includes many individual battles, is summarized in Joshua chapter 11. Which again refers to the Anakim giants and reveals that a few were left alive in Gath. And at that time Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from the mountains of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. This last detail is significant since it shines a light on the later account of the giant Goliath of Gath, who mocks Israel and God before being slain by David. Whilst many post-Enlightenment biblical scholars dismiss this kind of explanation due to its reliance on supernatural beings, such beings are an integral part of the biblical worldview. The Bible is crystal clear that angelic beings exist and produce hybrid offspring with human women, both before and after the flood. There is therefore no need to reject either of these biblical genocides as immoral, or even appeal to hyperbole or the salvation of the murdered infants. Rather, both of the biblical genocides, the Great Flood and the conquest of Canaan, can be adequately explained as necessary actions by a loving God to preserve humans as a distinct species. As Michael Heiser puts it, the rationale for harem annihilation was the specific elimination of the descendants of the Nephilim. But why is this so important to God, and why were the Nephilim in the land of Israel in the first place? The Bible does not spell this out, but many have speculated that the presence of giants in Canaan was a satanic plot to nullify the promises of God and to prevent the salvation of mankind through the atoning death of Christ. In the biblical worldview, the importance of bloodlines is not about one race being superior to another, but rather about the fulfillment of God's promises. In the Bible, God made a covenant promise to Abraham and his descendants that they would be a great nation and a blessing to the world in the land of Israel. He also made a covenant promise to David that he would raise up the Messiah from his descendants to rule the world in peace. Finally, he made a promise to the descendants of Adam that he has provided redemption through the man Jesus Christ, whilst the rebellious angels have no such redemption. They are condemned to hell for all eternity. In the light of these promises, the two attempts to mix the bloodlines of humans with the rebellious angels, especially in the place where the Israelite nation was to live and produce the Messiah, looks like a satanic plot to overthrow all the covenant promises of God by erasing the lines between human and angel, and by preventing the birth of Christ as the fully human son of Adam, Abraham, and David, who has upheld all the covenants and offers salvation to all who put their faith in him. This is Dan Stone, the Rational Creationist. Please see my website, swallowingtheredpill.com, and my book, Swallowing the Red Pill, which is available to buy on Amazon.